Hi everyone, we're going to be making a nature-inspired watercolor painting using a grid technique. Now it might not be exactly the way you think I mean when I use the word grid, but it'll all become clear in a little bit. So the first thing we have to do is decide what we're going to be making. So what I'm going to be doing is drawing myself a few thumbnail sketches. Now a thumbnail sketch is just a quick, short drawing that you do inside of a defined space. So I'm creating a few rectangles to represent the paper, and then I'm going to decide what I think I might want to do inside of my design. I can have my paper be horizontal or vertical. If I want to turn my paper in any direction, I can. And what I'm going to do is kind of decide the layout of what I might want to do. Now it could be the same subject, just done 3 different ways. Like let's say I want to draw a picture of some fruit and I'm looking at an actual pile of fruit, and I would definitely be looking at something before you draw, but you're actually looking at something and you're thinking about how it's going to look and where it's going to go, and you can actually just sort of sketch out your idea. All right, and so here I have one idea of some orange, an orange with some orange slices, all kind of lined up like this. I was looking at something specifically, a reference photo, so that I could draw this, or you could do it from real life. When you're drawing your thumbnail sketches, you definitely want to make sure you're using a reference of some sort, whether it's a reference image from the internet or a book or a magazine, or it's an actual real life object in front of you. For example, I have this little cute pretend cactus thing. It's actually lip balm, but if I wanted to use this as a reference, I could be looking at it and I could be drawing based on looking at it. So it could be an object that actually is in front of you or something you found online. Now your thumbnail sketches should just be quick little sketches. They don't need to be perfect. This is not super well drawn. It's just very rough, quick idea. I could keep going with this and maybe draw different types of fruit or the same fruit in different positions, larger, smaller, adding more things, or I could totally change gears and focus on a whole new direction. Maybe I look up a picture of some sort of flower. So far I've done a thumbnail sketch of oranges, so fruits, flower. Maybe I want to do some sort of animal or tree, or maybe I actually want to do some sort of landscape type of theme. So our theme for this painting is going to be nature, which is why all my thumbnail sketches focus on things from nature. Think fruits and vegetables, things that grow out of the ground, plant life, trees, flowers. Maybe insects would be a great one, animals, actual scenes from nature. The sky's the limit as long as it focuses on nature in some way. All right. Once you've done some thumbnail sketches, decide which one's your favorite that you're going to use for your final painting. Could just be one of them, or it could be none of them. Maybe you hate them all and you want to start over. That's fine. Flip your paper over, do a few more thumbnail sketches until you figure out something that you like. When you're ready, you're going to get a big, large piece of watercolor paper. Now you want to make sure that the dimensions of the watercolor paper you pick are going to be easy to evenly divide using a grid method. So by that I mean making sure that you can measure equal squares all throughout and that you don't end up with a really short side or really long side. So just make sure you're choosing proportional dimensions. I'm going to be using 3-inch squares, so 3 by 3 inch. If you choose to go smaller, like 2 by 2 inch, for example, you're going to want to make sure that the dimensions of your paper are even numbered so that it'll work out, that you can do it every 2 inches. If you're doing what I'm doing, then you're going to want to make sure that you have a set of numbers that are going to work that you can divide by 3. So this smaller paper is 12 by 9 inches, so 12 and 9 both can be easily divided by 3. And this larger one is 12 by 15. Again, both can easily be divided by 3, so it's going to make an ideal size for my 3 by 3 inch grid. First step is to redraw your design. Again, you want to be looking at your reference image, not necessarily your thumbnail sketch. Your thumbnail sketch is a good reference. It was sort of like a practice run. It wasn't meant to be the one that you copy from. So I'm going to take my pencil, and you want to draw this very lightly. and large. You want to really fill up your page so that you have lots of space for when you're painting. We are going to be painting this with watercolor, and watercolor can be really challenging to do tiny, fine details. So I do encourage going larger with this. When you draw, focus on the contour lines. Contour lines mean the outline shape of an object. So you want to focus on those outline shapes and not so much on the interior details. There shouldn't be any shading at all happening on this paper. You're just going to do outlines. All right, so I've drawn out the contours of my nature-themed image. I decided to go with an orange with a few slices. I put a little leaf falling on the ground as well because it felt a little off-center and empty, so I decided to add that. And now I'm going to grid my work. So I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to line my ruler up with the top of my paper. Now, when you are measuring, you do have to make sure that you are using a ruler properly. So a lot of rulers will start with the 0 being right at the end of the ruler, but sometimes you'll end up with a ruler like this one that I have, where the 0 actually starts inside the ruler. It's not at the end of the ruler, it's inward. So you have to make sure you start at 0. So it could be the end of the ruler, it might be inwards a little bit. You just have to check, see what kind of ruler you have, and make sure you're measuring properly. So I'm starting near the top of my paper, and I got my ruler at 0, and every 3 inches, I am going to make a dash. Now, if you decided to go with a smaller amount, like 2 by 2 or something, make sure your paper matches that. And I don't have to do any more because that's another 3 inches right there. So I've done my measurement at the top. Now, I'm not going to just take my ruler and start drawing straight lines, because the problem is I'm not sure exactly where to match it up at the bottom. And if you only measure one side and draw your line, there's a very good chance that you're going to end up having crooked, wobbly lines. So to ensure that doesn't happen, take your ruler, slide it to the bottom of your paper. I have it lined up with 0, and I'm making marks again at every 3 inches. And now I have a guide point at the bottom and at the top of my paper. So when I'm ready to draw my line, I can line my ruler up with one end, and I can line it up with the other end of the dash, and then draw my line. I'm choosing to draw my lines kind of lightly. I don't want them to be super dark because I just don't want it to be super obvious when I'm painting. And after you do one side, you're going to repeat the process the other way. So rotate your paper, and you're going to do the same exact thing. Line your ruler up at 0 at one end, mark every 3 inches, do this on the top and the bottom, and then connect the lines. All right, so now we're ready to paint our picture. We're going to be using watercolor for this, and our goal is to use all 8 of the techniques that we practiced in the previous video. I will have that linked below as well as up in the corner, so please review that and practice first before you jump onto this. And what we're going to do is every square is going to have a different technique featured in it. There's 8 techniques total, and as you can see, there are way more than 8 squares. So that means you're going to get to repeat and choose your favorite techniques in whatever squares that you want. Think about the quality of the object. Maybe you want to use a technique that kind of goes with that. Maybe you want to use a technique that is really, really random and different. There's multiple ways you can accomplish this, so I'm going to show you 2 finished results. In this one, I'm going to not really worry too much about the colors and if they match exactly and all of that. These are oranges, so you would think I would want to use all orange paint every time I paint the oranges, but I think I'm going to broaden my perception of it. I think I'm just going to go with warm colors. So if it's a warm color, red, orange, yellow, and anything kind of fitting into that world, that's what I think I'm going to use for these. And then I think I'm going to reserve cool colors for the background. You don't need to do that. You could do cool and warm and rainbow everywhere if you want. You could just mismatch it everywhere. You can be really specific and say, no, I'm only going to use orange paint when I am painting my oranges because I want this to be sort of realistic. However you want to do it. But at the end, no matter what method you pick, it is going to have a fun sort of I'm going to be using the Crayola Education watercolors. These are fantastic for just everyday and student use. They come out bright, they blend well, they're really beautiful finishes. It's really a great quality paint. I highly recommend it. So in order to get your paints ready, you're going to need to dip and drip. So I'm going to take my brush, dip it in the water, and drip it into the color or colors that I plan on using. Notice I'm not taking my brush and actually mixing. I showed this in the last video as well regarding watercolor. Same idea, just gonna dip and drip, put things on here. I'm not doing any actual mixing. I'm just dipping and dripping it into the colors to get them softened, to getting them ready to go. So when I am ready to paint, I don't have to spend too much time doing any mixing. They're really all just ready to go. Okay, when you are ready to paint, you have all your paints ready to go. Make sure you grab yourself a variety of brushes. You don't want to be stuck with just one size of brush and never be able to change it. If you have a big space, like I have this big square to do, I probably don't want to use a small brush. It might take too long to get done what I want to get done, so I might want to switch over to a much larger brush. If I am, however, doing something like the stem or the details here, I don't want this giant brush or even a medium brush. I want to go with a much smaller brush. So just make sure you have a variety so you can change which brush you're using depending on your needs. All right, so as I said, each section should feature a different technique. So I'm going to take the brush and I'm going to wet the paper, and I'm going to try really hard to stay inside the lines. And then quickly I'm going to switch over and start dipping in my colors. And now I have one square completed. Now, a couple quick things. As you're painting, you will probably notice that the paper is going to start to bow and ripple. Now that is something you can prevent if before you start painting you take some masking tape and you just tape down the edges onto your workspace. That will help this not to bow and ripple as much, and it'll also help it to dry flat as it's drying. I am intentionally not taping it down because I want to make sure I get right to the edges for this particular assignment, but that is an option. I want you to know that you can do that. Second thing, this is extremely important too. Now I'm ready to continue on. Now our natural desire is to just keep going in order. So we want to go this way or go down, kind of go in order of the grid. I'm going to highly recommend you do not do that. What will happen if I start painting here or here, which is right next to this very wet painted area, is my paint is going to bleed into each other. As careful as I try to be to keep this square on its own, my water and my paint is going to just bleed right in and kind of smear between the two. Now you might want that. Maybe you want to have a bunch of wet and wet all in a row and you want them to kind of bleed together. You could do multiple squares in a row that way and that would be totally fine. But if you're like most people when they're working and they don't want things to bleed into each other, I highly recommend not doing that. So if that's the case, what I would recommend is finding an entirely new square. You could skip over a square, you can skip to an entire new space on the paper, whatever you want to do. Let's say I want to work in this area. Maybe I want to do a similar wet and wet technique. In this square I have part of a background and part of the orange. Now I, again, don't want to paint both of these sections at the same exact time because if I'm painting this blue and this one orange colors, they are going to bleed into each other while they're wet and make a huge mess. So instead, I'm going to focus on one area of this. So I am just going to focus on just the background right now. So I finished the background, and just like I said before, you do not want to do the section right next to it right now because it will just bleed right into it. So I know I want this to be an entirely different color, so I'm going to not intentionally paint this or anything around it. So I'm kind of starting to limit my options of where I can go next. But I'm going to skip to a section that's not going to be touching or interfering it, maybe over here, and I'm going to try something different. If you recall from the last video, if you ever have too much paint, you can always just dry your brush off, then use your brush like a mop and soak up the paint. and that's how you can kind of get rid of some. You could also use a paper towel and dab at it. By dabbing at it, I mean pushing up and down, not taking it and rubbing it back and forth, because that'll just make a mess. So I'm going to continue painting this, always skipping around, making sure that I am not painting next to anything that is currently wet, and taking breaks when I need to, because if, let's say, everything has something next to it that's wet, then you have to kind of just sit and wait until something dries. But it is important to make sure you're skipping around a lot. Tip I want to bring up too, I will probably want to do dry brush on top of this leaf to do all of my veins and details, but you don't want to start with that. You want to start with what's underneath it. So what I'm going to be doing underneath is creating a wash, a very thin layer of the color that I need as a base, and then once it dries, I'll be able to go over it with thicker, darker paint with far less water, and then I'll be able to do all of my details. Watercolor is thin enough that you can definitely see through it to see the pencil underneath, and that can be a very strong benefit in this particular case, because you can then go in and do some details. So I'm just going to be doing sort of an under layer wash, wait for it to dry, and then I'll do some dry brush on top. have our finished watercolor grid nature painting. So as you can see, I chose to keep my colors for my subject to be warm and my background colors to be cool. You could do something similar if you want your subject to really kind of stand out from the background, but you might not want that. You might want your background and your subjects to all be kind of mixed up. So in which case, instead of picking certain colors for one and certain for the other, you might decide to kind of just do whatever wherever. So maybe some of these would be blues, some of these would be oranges, and it would be an even more obscure, kind of hard to identify image, but that could be really fun. It could be kind of secret and hidden in there. But as you can see, I made sure that every square and area featured a different feature, whether it was wet on wet, using the rubbing alcohol, maybe using the oil pastel or the salt. shading, 2-color blends. I tried to make sure that most everything inside each square was featuring that particular type of thing. All right, I hope you guys had fun doing this. I absolutely cannot wait to see what types of subjects you come up with, what types of color schemes you go with, and how it all comes out together. Have fun.